She had never expected anything like this to happen on an ordinary weekday morning. The message arrived quietly, almost blending into the rest of her day, as if it did not carry anything important at first glance. It was a simple invitation from a local cultural organizer, asking if she would be willing to perform at a small public gathering. The wording was polite but casual, almost like they were filling a gap in a program rather than selecting someone special. They mentioned it would be a light performance, something soft and simple, just a familiar tune to keep the atmosphere warm for guests. Nothing complicated, nothing demanding, just background music for a calm evening event. She read it twice, then a third time, trying to understand why they had chosen her. She was not known in any professional circle. She had no stage reputation, no awards hanging on her wall, no public recognition that would make someone think of her first. She had always played piano for herself, for quiet moments at home, and sometimes for close people who happened to hear her. That was all. Still, something about the invitation felt honest. It did not feel like a mistake, but it also did not feel like a big opportunity in the way people usually imagine opportunities. It felt small, almost fragile, like it could disappear if she thought too much about it. She hesitated before replying. A part of her wondered if she should refuse. Public performance was not something she had ever taken seriously. Playing alone was different. In private, there was no pressure, no eyes watching, no expectations hanging in the air. But this was different. This meant being seen. Yet another part of her felt a quiet pull. She had always loved the piano in a way she could not explain. The way each key responded to touch, the way sound could carry emotion without needing words. Even when she was unsure about many things in life, music was the one place where she felt steady. And maybe that was enough reason to say yes. So she accepted. After she confirmed, the organizers sent her the details. The event was being held at a modest hall in the city, a place often used for small cultural programs, school functions, and community gatherings. It was not a grand concert hall, but it had a stage, a piano, and an audience that usually came to spend an evening without expecting anything extraordinary. The instructions remained simple. Arrive early. Meet the stage coordinator. Play a short, simple piece. Keep it light and pleasant. Nothing more. There was something almost underwhelming about the way it was described, as if her presence was only a small part of a larger program that did not depend on her at all. Still, she prepared quietly. She did not tell many people about it. There was no reason to turn it into something big. In her mind, it was just a short appearance, nothing more. On the day of the event, she got ready without any rush. The weather outside was calm, with a soft breeze moving through the streets. The kind of day that did not demand attention. She carried herself in the same way, calm and steady, though inside there was a faint sense of curiosity she could not ignore. When she reached the venue, the building already had a quiet buzz of activity. People were moving chairs, checking sound equipment, arranging decorations, and preparing the stage for the evening. It was not chaotic, but it was active in a routine way, like everyone knew exactly what needed to be done. She stood for a moment near the entrance, observing everything. The hall was not large, but it had enough space to hold a decent crowd. Rows of chairs were set neatly facing a small stage at the front. A piano stood slightly to one side, covered and waiting. The instrument looked polished but not new, as if it had been used many times before for similar occasions. A staff member approached her after a short while and confirmed her name against a list. There was no excitement in the interaction, just routine acknowledgement. She was guided toward the backstage area, a narrow space behind the curtain where performers usually waited before their turn. Backstage was quieter than the rest of the hall. There were a few chairs, some water bottles, and a mirror mounted on the wall. The atmosphere was calm but carried a faint tension, the kind that always existed before a performance, no matter how small. She sat down for a moment, watching the movement of people through the gaps in the curtain. She could hear the audience beginning to arrive. Soft conversations filled the hall, blending into a low background hum. Some people laughed lightly, others talked about their day, and a few simply waited in silence. It was clear that most of them were not there for her. They had come for the event itself, not any individual performer. That realization did not hurt her, but it made everything feel more distant, almost like she was not really part of their evening yet. At one point, she heard two staff members speaking near the stage entrance. Their voices were not loud, but the words carried enough to be understood. "It's just a short filler performance," one of them said casually. "Nothing too serious. Just something simple before the main segment." The other responded with a small laugh, agreeing. "Good. We don't want anything too long, anyway. The audience is here for the program, not a solo act." She did not react outwardly, but she heard everything clearly. She looked down at her hands, resting quietly in her lap. They were calm, steady, familiar. Those hands had spent countless hours on piano keys, exploring melodies when no one was watching. But here, in this place, they were being prepared for something that others saw as insignificant. Still, she did not feel offended. If anything, she felt something else growing quietly inside her. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of focus. A stillness that gathered slowly, like water settling after being disturbed. A stage coordinator eventually entered the backstage area and briefly explained the order of performances. Her name appeared somewhere in the middle. The instructions were simple. Walk on stage when called. Sit at the piano. Play the assigned piece. Keep it short. The coordinator did not look at her for long. It was not disrespectful, just busy. There were many things happening at once, and her part in it was considered small. She nodded and listened carefully, saying nothing more than necessary. As the evening drew closer, the hall began to fill. The sound of chairs being occupied grew more frequent. Conversations blended into a steady wave of noise that slowly rose and then softened as people settled into their seats. The lights in the hall were adjusted, creating a warm glow over the audience area, while the stage remained slightly brighter. From where she sat, she could sense the shift in atmosphere. The event was about to begin. A few early performances took place before hers. She listened quietly from backstage. There was singing, a short speech, and a simple musical act. The audience responded politely, clapping at the right moments, but nothing felt intense or deeply emotional. It was the kind of evening where everything moved in a comfortable rhythm, without surprises. As her turn approached, she stood up slowly. There was no visible nervousness in her movements, but inside, she felt a quiet awareness building. Not fear, not excitement in the usual sense, but something in between. A sharpened attention to everything around her. She walked closer to the curtain opening, waiting for her name to be called. From behind the stage, she could now clearly see the audience. Rows of faces, some attentive, some distracted, some simply waiting for the next segment to pass. She took a slow breath. This was the moment where she was still unknown to them. Just another performer in a simple program. Nothing more. Nothing yet to remember. And then her name was called. She stepped forward when her name was called, moving from the quiet backstage area toward the bright opening of the stage. The sound of her footsteps was soft, almost swallowed by the low hum of the audience. For a moment, it felt like she was walking between two completely different worlds. Behind her was silence, preparation, and waiting. Ahead of her was light, attention, and a room full of strangers watching without knowing anything about her. The curtain opened slightly as she approached, and the brightness of the stage lights gently touched her face. She paused for a brief moment before stepping fully into view. It was not hesitation, but a natural pause, like taking a breath before entering deep water. Then she walked forward with steady steps. The hall was not too large, but in that moment it felt wider than it really was. Rows of chairs stretched out in front of her, filled with people sitting close together. Some leaned back comfortably, others sat forward with mild interest, and a few were still adjusting their attention as the program continued. The atmosphere was calm, almost casual, like most of them were there just to spend an ordinary evening. She noticed how little attention she was receiving at first. A few people looked at her briefly, then returned to their conversations or phones. It was not disrespectful, just indifferent. She was not yet important to their evening. To them, she was simply the next item on a list. She moved toward the piano placed on the stage. It stood slightly to one side, polished under the stage lights. It looked familiar in shape, but also unfamiliar in this setting. A piano always feels different when it is placed in front of an audience. It is no longer just an instrument. It becomes something that carries expectation. She stood beside it for a moment before sitting down. Her hands lightly touched the edge of the seat as she adjusted herself. The chair felt firm but slightly different from what she was used to. Small details like this often went unnoticed by the audience, but for a performer, everything mattered in those first few seconds. She placed her hands gently in her lap and looked at the keys. The piano keys reflected a soft shine under the light, arranged neatly, waiting. There was a strange kind of silence in that moment, even though the hall was not truly silent. It was the silence that forms inside a person before something begins. She could still hear faint background sounds from the audience. A chair shifting, a quiet cough, a small whisper that faded quickly. But none of it reached her mind in a disturbing way. It all felt distant, like it belonged to another layer of space. The stage coordinator gave a small signal from the side, reminding her that everything was ready. She gave a slight nod in response. No words were exchanged. None were needed. For a brief moment, she let her eyes move across the hall again. She did not look at any one person for too long. Instead, she saw them as a whole presence. A crowd of unknown faces, each carrying their own thoughts, their own expectations, or lack of expectations. It was clear that most of them were not focused on her yet. Some were still settling into their seats, others were finishing conversations, and a few were simply waiting for the program to continue. She understood that she had not earned their attention yet. That was not something given freely. It had to be created through sound, through presence, through something that spoke louder than words. She turned her attention back to the piano. Her fingers slowly moved closer to the keys, but did not press them yet. There was a pause, a small space of stillness before the beginning. In that space, everything felt sharper. The lights felt brighter. The air felt slightly heavier. Even her own breathing felt more noticeable. She thought briefly about what had been said earlier backstage, that it was just a simple filler performance. Something short, something easy, something not meant to stand out. She did not argue with that thought. She accepted it as it was given. But inside her, there was another quiet understanding. Simple did not always mean empty, and easy did not always mean without depth. She placed both hands on the piano keys. The first note had not yet been played, but something had already changed. Her posture shifted slightly, becoming more focused. Her shoulders relaxed, not from carelessness, but from readiness. The room was still unaware of what was about to happen. For a second, she closed her eyes. Not fully, just enough to gather her thoughts. Then she opened them again and pressed the first key. The sound that came out was soft and gentle. It was exactly what was expected. A simple beginning. Familiar, calm, and unchallenging. The audience barely reacted. A few people adjusted their sitting positions. A few others continued to glance around. It was nothing out of the ordinary. She continued playing. The melody followed the expected pattern. It was simple, steady, and easy to recognize. It created a pleasant atmosphere, but nothing that demanded full attention. This was the part everyone had been told to expect. And for a short while, everything remained that way. The audience stayed relaxed. The program continued in its usual flow. No one seemed surprised. No one seemed particularly moved. It was exactly the kind of performance that blended into the background of an evening event. But something subtle began to change. It started almost unnoticeably. A slight shift in rhythm. A gentle variation in tone. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately stand out. But if someone had been listening carefully, they might have felt a small difference growing beneath the surface. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. Still controlled, still careful, but no longer just following the simple pattern. There was a quiet depth beginning to form in the sound. A few audience members started to look toward the stage again. Not fully aware of why, but sensing something slightly different. A small change in feeling that was hard to define. The melody continued, but it was no longer just the assigned tune. It was slowly becoming something else. She did not rush. She did not force anything. Each note seemed to grow naturally from the one before it. The piano was no longer just an instrument following instructions. It was becoming a space where emotions started to take shape. A few heads in the audience turned more clearly toward the stage. Some people who had been distracted now paused their conversations. Others lowered their phones without realizing it. Still, there was no sudden reaction. No applause. No visible shock. Only a quiet shift in attention. She remained focused. Her expression did not change dramatically. There was no exaggerated emotion on her face. Instead, there was calm concentration, as if she was deeply connected to something only she could fully hear. The simple tune was still present, but now it carried layers beneath it. Soft changes in pace. Slight emotional rises and falls. Moments of gentle pause followed by flowing continuation. The audience began to feel it more clearly now. It was not just music anymore. It was becoming something that held attention without asking for it. Something that slowly pulled focus away from everything else in the room. A man in the middle row stopped shifting in his seat and looked directly at the stage. A woman nearby lowered her conversation and turned her head slightly. Others followed in small, quiet reactions. Still, the hall remained mostly silent in response. Not because nothing was happening, but because people were not yet sure what they were experiencing. The performance was still unfolding. And at that moment, no one in the room fully understood that the simple tune they were expecting was no longer simple at all. The sound of the piano continued to fill the hall, but now something about it felt different from the beginning. The first part had been simple, almost predictable, like a gentle introduction meant for background comfort. Yet slowly, without any obvious signal, it had started to change shape. The audience did not fully understand it yet, but attention in the room was no longer divided. More and more people were beginning to look toward the stage. She remained seated at the piano, calm and focused, as if she was still following the same plan she had been given. From the outside, nothing about her appearance suggested anything unusual. Her posture was steady. Her expression was composed. Her movements were controlled and natural. But inside that calm surface, there was a deeper flow guiding every note. The simple tune was still there, but it was no longer staying in its original form. It was stretching gently, like a path slowly turning into a landscape. Small changes appeared in rhythm, soft variations in tone, and subtle shifts in emotion. Nothing sudden, nothing forced, just a quiet transformation that was difficult to notice at first. In the audience, a few people who had been distracted earlier now started paying closer attention. A man who had been leaning back in his chair sat a little forward without realizing it. A woman who had been holding a conversation slowly stopped speaking. Even those who had not planned to focus on the performance found their eyes drifting back toward the stage. Still, there was no strong reaction yet. The hall had not erupted into applause or surprise. Instead, there was a growing silence, the kind that forms when people are unsure of what they are hearing but feel unwilling to look away. She continued playing. Her fingers moved across the keys with quiet confidence. Each note followed the next in a smooth flow, but now there was something more alive in the sound. The melody carried a feeling that could not easily be described. It was no longer just something pleasant to hear. It was beginning to feel personal, as if it was speaking without words. The audience started to notice this change more clearly. A few heads turned slightly, trying to understand what was happening. Some people leaned forward a little more. Others became still, as if any movement might break the moment unfolding in front of them. Conversations had completely stopped now. Even the smallest background noises in the hall seemed to fade. At the edge of the stage, the staff members who had earlier described the performance as just a filler now exchanged quiet glances. They had expected a simple piece, something short and forgettable. But what they were hearing did not feel like something meant to be forgotten. Still, there was no dramatic shift yet. The performance was not loud or overly complex. It was not trying to shock anyone. Instead, it was doing something more subtle. It was pulling attention slowly, without asking permission. She did not look at the audience. Her eyes stayed on the piano keys. Her focus remained steady, as if she was in a space where only sound existed. Every movement of her hands seemed intentional but natural, like she was not thinking about what came next, but simply allowing it to appear. The melody deepened. What began as a simple tune was now layered with emotion. Soft rises in tone carried a sense of warmth, while gentle pauses created moments of quiet reflection. It was as if the music was telling a story without needing words. A story that could not be fully explained, but could be felt. Some people in the audience began to feel something unfamiliar. Not excitement yet, not shock, but a kind of quiet emotional pull. They could not clearly explain why they were suddenly so focused, but they found themselves unable to turn away. A young listener in the back row adjusted their posture and sat completely still. An older attendee who had seen many performances before narrowed their eyes slightly, as if trying to understand the skill behind what was happening. Even those who usually remained indifferent during such events were now watching closely. The hall was becoming quieter than before, but it was not an empty silence. It was a focused silence, filled with attention. She continued without pause. Her fingers moved with increasing control, but still without force. There was a natural flow in the way she played, as if the piano was responding to her rather than being controlled by her. Each note seemed to carry intention, yet nothing felt planned in a mechanical way. The earlier simplicity of the piece had not disappeared. Instead, it had been transformed. It was still recognizable, but now it felt like it had grown into something more meaningful. The audience began to sense this transformation more clearly. A few people exchanged small, quiet looks with each other, not speaking, just reacting silently. It was as if they were trying to confirm that they were all experiencing the same thing. A shared confusion, mixed with growing curiosity. One person near the center row slowly lowered their hands from their lap and leaned slightly forward. Another person who had been glancing at the stage casually now stared directly, not moving at all. The collective attention of the room was shifting in a way that could not be ignored. Still, there was no applause. No interruption. Just growing awareness. She remained fully absorbed in the performance. Her expression did not show strain or effort. Instead, it reflected deep concentration. It was the kind of focus that comes when someone is completely inside the moment, not thinking about observers or reactions, only about the sound itself. The piano notes became more expressive. There were gentle changes in speed, soft increases in intensity followed by calm releases. It felt like waves moving through water, never breaking suddenly, but always in motion. The music began to carry emotion in a way that reached beyond simple sound. People in the audience were now fully aware that something unusual was happening. This was not the simple background performance they had expected. It was not something to ignore or casually listen to while thinking about other things. It demanded attention, not loudly but steadily. Even those who had initially dismissed the performance now found themselves watching without distraction. A staff member near the side of the stage leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the pianist. There was a visible change in their expression, from casual indifference to quiet curiosity. They had seen many performers before, but this was not something they had anticipated from a simple tune. The hall felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted without announcement. It was no longer just a regular program. It felt like the room itself had become quieter, as if the space was holding its breath. She continued to play, and with every passing moment, the simple tune she had been asked to perform was no longer simple in the minds of those listening. It was becoming something else entirely, something they were only beginning to understand. She continued playing the piano, and by now, the atmosphere in the hall had clearly changed. What began as a simple background performance had slowly turned into something that held attention in a quiet, powerful way. The audience was no longer divided or distracted. Most eyes were now directed toward the stage, even if people were still trying to understand what exactly they were witnessing. Her hands moved with steady control over the keys. The melody that once sounded ordinary had transformed into something deeper, something that carried emotion in a way that felt almost personal to each listener. Yet she did not show any signs of trying to impress anyone. There was no dramatic expression on her face, no visible effort to draw attention. She simply continued, as if she were following something already written in her mind. The piano notes flowed naturally, one after another, like water moving through quiet ground. The sound filled the hall without being loud or overwhelming. It was not about volume. It was about feeling. And that feeling was slowly spreading through the audience. In the middle rows, a few people who had been sitting casually earlier now leaned forward slightly. Their posture had changed without them even noticing. Others who had been distracted before were now completely still. Even the smallest movements in the hall seemed to slow down, as if the entire room was adjusting itself to the rhythm of the performance. She remained focused, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. Each movement of her fingers was smooth, controlled, and confident. There was a quiet connection between her and the instrument, something that could not be easily explained but was clearly visible in the way she played. The melody shifted gently again. What had started as a simple tune was now carrying layers of emotion. Soft changes in tone created moments of calm reflection, followed by gentle rises that added depth and intensity. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, like a story unfolding one page at a time. The audience could feel it more strongly now. A few people exchanged brief glances, not speaking, but acknowledging silently that something unusual was happening. There was a shared realization forming in the room, though no one said it out loud. The performance was no longer just part of the program. It had become the center of attention. At the side of the stage, a few staff members stood quietly. Earlier, they had treated the performance as something minor, just a short filler between segments. Now their expressions had changed. They were watching more closely, as if trying to understand when exactly the shift had happened. One of them leaned slightly toward another, but no words were spoken. There was no need. The silence in the room said enough. She continued playing without looking up. Her presence at the piano was calm but strong. There was no unnecessary movement, no distraction. Everything about her focus was directed into the music. It was as if the world outside the stage no longer existed for her. The audience, however, was becoming more aware with each passing second. A man in the back row, who had earlier been relaxed and uninterested, now sat upright with his hands resting still in his lap. A woman nearby who had been glancing around the hall earlier was now fully focused on the stage. Even those who had originally come just to pass time were now completely engaged. The sound continued to evolve. The melody was still recognizable in parts, but it had grown into something richer. It carried emotion in a way that felt unplanned, yet perfectly balanced. It was neither too complex nor too simple anymore. It had reached a space in between where feeling mattered more than structure. She moved through the piece with quiet confidence. Her fingers pressed the keys with precision, but there was also softness in her touch. The combination created a sound that felt both controlled and free at the same time. It was this balance that seemed to hold the audience without force. The hall was now almost completely silent. Even the smallest sounds had faded. No whispering, no movement. Only the piano filled the space. The silence was not empty. It was full of attention. She continued. A slight change in rhythm appeared again, subtle but noticeable. The music seemed to breathe, rising and falling gently. It created a feeling that was difficult to describe, as if the melody was speaking directly to something inside each listener. Some people felt a quiet emotional pull, though they could not explain why. It was not loud or overwhelming. It was gentle, but it stayed with them. A few heads tilted slightly, as if trying to catch every detail of the sound. Others kept their eyes fixed on the performer, without blinking. The room had become completely absorbed in the moment. She did not react to the audience. There was no glance outward, no acknowledgement of their growing attention. She stayed within her own focus, deeply connected to the piano. Her expression remained calm, but there was something steady and strong in her presence. The performance continued to build slowly, not in speed or volume, but in feeling. Each section added something new without breaking what came before. It was like layers forming over time, each one adding depth without taking away what was already there. The audience could sense this growth. It was no longer just about listening. It had become about feeling. People were no longer just hearing notes. They were experiencing something that touched them in ways they did not expect. A few people in the front rows now had completely still expressions, as if they were afraid that even a small sound might break the moment. Others sat with quiet intensity, fully engaged in what was unfolding. The staff near the stage now looked visibly surprised. What was supposed to be a short, simple performance had turned into something that held the entire hall without effort.
Still, she played on.
There was no rush in her movements, no attempt to speed up or slow down for effect. Everything felt natural, as if the music itself was guiding her hands. The melody softened for a brief moment. It created a gentle pause in emotion, like a calm breath in the middle of a long thought. The audience remained silent, waiting without realizing they were waiting. Then the sound slowly began to rise again. Not suddenly, but gradually. A soft return of intensity, a gentle increase in emotional depth. It felt like the performance was preparing to move into something even deeper, though no one yet knew what that would be. The hall remained completely focused. Every person there, in their own way, was now connected to the stage. And at the center of it all, she continued to play, still calm, still composed, still fully absorbed in the piano and the unfolding music that was no longer simple at all. The hall was now completely different from how it had been at the beginning of the evening. What started as a simple program filled with casual attention had turned into a space of full silence and deep focus. Every person inside seemed to be connected to the stage in some way, even if they could not fully explain why. The piano performance had slowly taken over the atmosphere, not through force, but through feeling. She remained seated at the piano, still calm, still focused, as if nothing around her had changed. But in reality, everything had changed. The audience was no longer passive. They were no longer simply watching an event. They were experiencing something that was growing with every passing second. Her fingers moved across the keys with steady control. The melody that had started as something simple was now rich with emotion. It had depth, softness, and quiet strength all at once. The sound filled the hall gently, yet it carried a weight that made people pay closer attention without realizing it. There was no longer any background noise in the hall. No whispers. No movement. Even the smallest distractions had disappeared. It was as if the entire room had agreed, without words, to stay still. She continued playing. The music shifted again, but this time the change felt more noticeable. It was not sudden or loud. It was a gradual rise in intensity, like a wave slowly building before reaching its peak. The melody became more expressive, carrying more emotion than before. The audience could feel it. A few people in the middle rows leaned forward slightly again, as if drawn closer by the sound. Others held completely still, their eyes fixed on the stage. There was a growing sense that something important was happening, something that could not be ignored. At the side of the stage, the staff members were now fully attentive. Earlier, they had treated the performance as a simple filler, something light and unimportant. Now they were watching with clear interest. One of them quietly adjusted their position, standing a little straighter, eyes locked on the performer. No one spoke. There was no need for conversation anymore. She did not look up. Her focus remained on the piano. Her expression stayed calm, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. It was not about showing emotion outwardly. It was about channeling it through sound. The melody continued to grow. It was still recognizable in its foundation, but now it carried layers that were not present at the beginning. Soft rises in tone created a feeling of warmth, while gentle pauses added depth. The music felt alive, as if it was breathing. The audience could sense that something was building. There was a shared feeling in the room, even though no one had spoken about it. People were beginning to realize that this was not just a simple performance anymore. It had become something that demanded full attention. A woman near the front row placed her hands together in her lap and sat perfectly still. A man nearby slightly tilted his head, focusing more deeply on the sound. Others seemed almost afraid to move, as if any small action might break the moment. The music grew stronger. Not louder in a harsh way, but fuller, more expressive. The emotion in the notes became more visible, more powerful. It was no longer just a melody. It was becoming a story told through sound. She moved into a more complex section of the piece. Her hands moved faster now, but still with complete control. Every note felt intentional, every transition smooth and connected. There was no confusion in her movement, only flow. It was clear she knew exactly where she was going, even if the audience did not. The hall felt completely absorbed. Time seemed slower inside the room. People were no longer thinking about anything outside the performance. Their attention was fully locked onto the stage. Even those who had originally come without interest were now completely drawn in. The melody reached a deeper, emotional point. It carried a feeling that was difficult to describe. Some listeners felt calm. Others felt a quiet emotional pull. Some simply watched in silence, unable to move or look away. It was different for each person, but the impact was clear for all. She remained steady. There was no change in her outward expression, but her focus felt even stronger. Her connection with the piano seemed complete, as if she and the instrument were speaking the same language without words. The performance continued to rise. A gentle build in intensity began again, but this time it felt more powerful than before. The sound was not overwhelming, but it carried depth that filled every corner of the hall. It reached people in a way that felt personal, as if it was meant for each listener individually. The audience reacted silently. A few eyes widened slightly. Some people took a slow breath without realizing it. Others sat completely still, almost frozen in attention. There was a shared sense that something important was unfolding in real time. At the edge of the stage, one of the staff members looked visibly surprised. Their earlier assumption that this would be a simple performance had completely changed. Now they were watching with a kind of quiet respect, as if seeing something they had not expected at all. She continued playing without pause. The piano sounded fuller now, richer in emotion. Each section of the melody seemed to connect with the next in a smooth and natural way. There was no break in flow, only continuous expression. The audience was fully engaged. No one was distracted anymore. No one was looking away. Every person in the room was focused on the stage, waiting, feeling, listening. The music reached another turning point. It softened for a brief moment, creating a gentle space in the performance. This pause was not empty. It felt like a breath before something deeper. The audience remained completely silent, sensing that the moment was not over yet. Then the melody began to rise again. This time with more strength, more emotion, more depth. It felt like the performance was moving toward something significant, something that had been building from the very beginning. The sound carried a sense of direction, as if it was leading somewhere important. She stayed completely in control. Her hands moved with confidence, her posture steady, her focus unbroken. There was no hesitation in her movements. Everything was smooth, natural, and deeply connected to the music. The audience could feel the change clearly now. What had once been a simple tune was no longer simple at all. It had transformed into something that held the entire hall in complete silence. People were no longer just listening. They were experiencing it deeply. The hall felt smaller in that moment, as if everything had drawn closer to the stage. And at the center of it all, she continued to play, fully immersed in the rising emotion of the music that was now far beyond anything anyone had expected when it first began. The hall was completely silent now, but it was not the kind of silence that feels empty. It was full of attention, full of emotion, and full of something unspoken that everyone in the room was sharing at the same time. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the smallest sound seemed impossible in that moment. She sat at the piano, still calm, still steady, but now fully inside the performance. Her fingers moved with quiet control, pressing each key with care and feeling. The music had grown far beyond what anyone expected when it first began. What was introduced as a simple tune had turned into something deep, emotional, and unforgettable. The melody carried strength now, but also softness. It rose and fell like waves, filling the hall completely. It was no longer just background music or a short filler piece. It had become the center of the entire evening. Every person in the audience was now connected to it in their own way. Some felt calm. Some felt emotional. Some simply watched in silence, unable to look away. The feeling in the room was shared, even if the reactions were different. She continued playing, Her expression remained composed, but there was something powerful in her focus. It was not about showing emotion on her face. It was about expressing it through sound. Every movement of her hands felt natural, like she was not forcing anything, only allowing the music to flow through her. The melody now reached its deepest point. It was rich, layered, and full of meaning. Each note seemed to carry something unspoken, something that words could not describe. The audience felt it clearly, even if they could not explain it. A few people leaned slightly forward again, without realizing it. Others held their breath for a moment before slowly releasing it. The entire room felt suspended in time, as if everything outside the hall had disappeared. At the edge of the stage, the staff members stood completely still. Earlier in the evening, they had treated the performance as something light and simple. Now their expressions showed clear surprise. They were no longer thinking about schedules or program order. They were only watching, fully focused on what was happening in front of them. She moved into the final part of the piece. The music began to shift again. It did not become louder or faster in a sudden way. Instead, it started to rise gently, building towards something that felt like a conclusion. There was a sense of direction in every note, as if the performance was slowly approaching its final moment. The audience felt this change immediately. A quiet tension filled the room. Not uncomfortable, but emotional. People knew something was coming, but they did not want it to end. The music had created a space that held everyone together, and no one wanted to leave it. Her hands moved with more expression now, but still with full control. The notes were stronger, more defined, but still smooth. The piano sounded full, rich, and alive. The melody began to climb. Each section added more depth, more feeling. It was as if the entire journey of the performance was being gathered into this final movement. Everything that had been built before was now coming together. The audience remained completely silent. No one interrupted. No one reacted loudly. They were all waiting, fully focused on the stage. Even the smallest movements had stopped. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. She continued with steady focus. Her posture remained unchanged, but her energy felt stronger now. There was a sense of completion forming in the music. Every note felt important, every moment meaningful. The final emotional rise began. The melody became fuller, carrying a deep sense of expression. It was not about technical skill anymore. It was about feeling. The sound filled every corner of the hall, touching people in a quiet but powerful way. Some audience members had slightly widened eyes. Others simply stared, completely absorbed. A few had their hands resting still in their laps, as if afraid to move. There was a shared understanding in the room that something special was reaching its end. She played the final sequence. The notes slowed slightly, giving space for each sound to settle. There was a gentle softness now, a calming presence in the music as it approached its final moment. The last few notes were played with care. Each one felt clear, simple, and deeply expressive. The final sound lingered in the air, slowly fading but not disappearing immediately. It stayed for a moment, filling the silence that followed. Then she pressed the final key. The sound ended. For a brief moment, there was nothing. No applause. No movement. No sound at all. Just silence. A complete, heavy silence that felt different from the beginning of the performance. This silence was not empty. It was full of emotion, full of thought, full of everything the audience had just experienced. She remained still at the piano. Her hands rested gently on the keys. She did not move immediately. It was as if she was giving space for the final note to settle into the room. The audience still did not react. It felt like no one was ready to break the moment. People were still processing what they had just heard. The transformation from a simple tune to something so powerful had left a deep impression. Then, slowly, something changed. A single clap was heard, then another. And then, suddenly, the entire hall erupted into applause. It was not polite applause. It was not routine. It was strong, loud, and filled with genuine emotion. People stood up almost at the same time, as if they could not stay seated any longer. The sound filled the hall completely. She finally lifted her hands from the piano and sat quietly for a moment. Her expression remained calm, but there was a subtle sense of relief and quiet understanding in her presence. She turned slightly toward the audience. Now she could see them clearly. Faces that were earlier indifferent were now filled with admiration and surprise. People who had not paid attention at the beginning were now standing and clapping with full focus. The applause continued. It did not fade quickly. It lasted, strong and steady, filling the space she had just filled with music. Some people exchanged looks of disbelief, still trying to understand how a simple performance had turned into something so powerful. Others simply kept clapping, still caught in the emotion of what they had just experienced. At the side of the stage, staff members joined in the applause as well. Their earlier assumptions were completely gone now. What they had expected to be a short, simple filler performance had become the highlight of the entire evening. She stood up slowly from the piano bench. For a moment, she just stood there, taking in the response. There was no dramatic reaction from her, only quiet acceptance. She slightly bowed her head in gratitude. The applause grew once more in response. The audience was still standing, still clapping, still connected to the moment that had just ended. And as she walked away from the piano, the sound of appreciation followed her, echoing through the hall, marking the end of a performance that no one there would forget, even though it had begun as something simple.